Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so today I'm showing you a very special, very interesting new card that's coming out in Japan. It is the wonderfully titled Team Rocket's Harassment. Now this is coming out in the Ash vs Team Rocket deck. I showed you this earlier because I talked you through Pikachu GX and Mimikyu GX, and you can find links to both of those videos in the description for this one. Now, we don't know if we're going to be getting these cards in the US, UK, etc. A lot of the time when Japan has special cards based on movies and such, we don't get them, but I do hope we get this card. What this card says is both players shuffle their hand into their decks and draw 5 cards. It's basically Shauna, but both players have to do it, or to put it another way, Judge, but both players gain an extra card, and it works in the way you would expect it to be. It is like a Judge, which draws you more cards, yay, and gives your opponent more cards, mostly boo, but sometimes yay. So let's look at it from both sides. For you, it's basically just playing a Shauna. Now, Shauna's always been played a little bit for a number of reasons. One of them is we don't want to have to play a Sycamore and discard cards from our hand. And also, late in the game, or for decks that get a big lead or go out really fast, we don't like the card N. The problem with N is that if we've taken 4 or 5 prizes, we get 1 or 2 cards when we play the N. If we're playing an aggressive deck or take a big lead, N becomes annoying for us and better for our opponent. So in that way, I really quite like Team Rocket's Harassment. But of course, it's also like a Shauna for your opponent. Now in the early game, this is better than an N. Because if your opponent draws 7 cards at the beginning and plays down their basic for the turn, let's call it a Poplio for argument's sake, then they've got 6 cards in their hand. You play Team Rocket's Harassment, and then they start the turn with 5 cards in hand, 1 fewer than if you had played an N, or just left them alone to start their turn as normal. But that isn't really the great use for this, because obviously after they've taken 1 prize, you're doing the same as if you played an N, and after your opponent's taken 2 prizes, you're actually giving them more cards than they would have if you played an N. So why does this card warrant talking about? Because you can deck out your opponent. If your opponent in their deck and hand combined have 5 or fewer cards, then they will draw every card in their deck, and at the beginning of their next turn, they will be unable to draw a card, and they will lose the game. And a lot of the time, people try and avoid being end to very few cards, and what they do is they make their deck as small as possible. Because the fewer cards you've got in deck, the greater the chance you draw that last double colourless energy if your opponent ends you to 1 or 2. So if your opponent tries to have very few cards in deck to protect themselves against a late game N, you play Team Rocket's Harassment and deck them out to win. And if they try and keep their deck big to avoid Team Rocket's Harassment, then you play an N so they don't draw what they want. And of course at the moment, at least until the end of August, we've got Versus Seeker, so you can choose which one you play to annoy your opponent the most. And this is the same theory, I don't know how many of you remember this, but there was a Misdreavus that came out and was then reprinted in Call of Legends, which had double draw where both players drew 3 cards. Well, we might use this occasionally, and people did, to make sure your opponent draws the last cards in their deck and then loses the game when they're unable to draw a card to begin their turn. On the stream over in London recently, we saw a Gyarados player lose a game because they were playing Lucky Helmet and they drew so many cards they lost the game. I'm not saying Team Rocket's Harassment is going to win you many games, and certainly as soon as your opponent knows you play it, then it's a slight problem because they can try and avoid it. But as I've said, the more they try and avoid this, the more vulnerable they are to N. Now, Misdreavus rotated a while ago, but if you want a card you can do this with, try Togepi. Now, Togepi only forces your opponent to draw 1 card, But if your opponent's got 6 cards combined in their hand and deck, then you play Team Rocket's Harassment, attack with Togepi, and then your opponent will deck out and you will win the game. Now, the Comfey coming out in Guardians Rising also forces your opponent to draw a card, but although it's got a really nice ability, the attack costs 2 energy, and that's a little bit expensive. Plus, you're really telegraphing what you're going to do, because who's putting 2 energy onto a Comfey? The thing I really like, though, is, as much as this is a fun little unusual card to occasionally win the odd game by decking out your opponent, it's still useful for you in the early game. So other cards that you might play to try and win the odd game include cards like Team Flare Grunt and Delinquent. But if you have no draw cards in the first turn of the game, Delinquent and Team Flare Grunt are just rubbish and there's no point having them. Whereas if you don't draw your Sycamore, you don't draw your N, but you do draw your single copy of Team Rocket's Harassment, well, it still gets you a new hand of 5. I quite like it. Now, the reality is, I'm going to have to give this between 2 and 3 Wassies. We don't give half Wassies. That would be barbaric. As much fun as this can be, and I guarantee if you play enough games with this card in your deck, you will get the odd win by deck out, and as much as it does help you to draw in the early game, I just fear that the combination of Sycamore, N, and in fact Shauna herself mean that we don't necessarily need this card as a draw card, and I'm not sure it's quite good enough as a trying to deck your opponent out, cheeky winning the game card. But I love the art, and I love the idea, and I love unusual cards that allow you to do unusual things, and this very much fits that description. Now, you know the deal, ladies and gentlemen, there is a comment section. Go nuts, be nice. There are buttons to both like this video and subscribe to this channel, and I would be delighted if you would use them both. Make sure that you're following me on Twitter @TheWassie, and of course, the most important thing as always, look after yourselves until next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.